Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Connie, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing with you some fall-inspired desserts that we have been enjoying over the last couple of weeks. Now the kids and I went to the orchard probably a month or so ago, and we picked up so many apples that it got to be a little overwhelming. We had all that we could handle eating fresh apples every day. And then I started thinking, what are some other ways that I can use up some of these apples? Now, in today's video, I'm going to share with you one of our favorite types of apple pie. It's not the traditional apple pie, but it's a Dutch apple pie. We're also going to be making some apple pie filling. The last dessert I'm going to be sharing with you is one of our favorites, and it's an apple harvest coffee cake. It not only has chunks of apple in it, but it also has applesauce to make it nice and moist, and it's the perfect amount of sweet and spice with the cinnamon that's added to it. And it's perfect for this time of year because not only we have the abundance of apples, but also because it's perfect for when you have company come over, or if you're going to go visiting to bring along with you. It's delicious, and I really, if you only try one of these recipes, I hope that this is the one because you're gonna like it the most. Let's get started.
For this first apple pie dessert recipe, we are making a Dutch apple pie. I am going to get started by making a homemade pie crust. The first thing we're going to do is measure out 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour, a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and a 1/2 teaspoon of sugar. Then we're going to cut up 8 tablespoons of cold butter. The key is to keep this butter nice and cold when you're mixing up your pie crust. If you are like me and are experimenting with fresh milled flour, I suggest you watch my easy pie crust with fresh milled flour video. In this video, I show how to make a quick and easy pie crust with your food processor. I had a viewer comment on that video wondering about how to make an easy pie crust if you don't have a food processor. So today I am going to make this pie crust with no extra gadgets and with all-purpose flour. Once I get all of my butter cut up and added into my flour, I'm going to use my fingers to slowly start crushing that butter into tiny pieces. And then I start measuring in my water 1 tablespoon at a time. Make sure that you don't get any of the ice pieces added into your pie crust, because as that melts, you'll find that it will just make that part of your pie crust much too moist and it won't roll out nicely later on. So you're going to keep pinching and mixing all of that butter into the flour and getting your water mixed in. You want the butter to be anywhere from the size of rice to probably pea size as you're mixing it into your flour. I'm going to pack it all together into a nice disc, and then I'm going to store it in the refrigerator for at least 1 hour to get it nice and cold again and to let the flour absorb all of the moisture from the water that I've added in. I've left this sit up to 3 days in my refrigerator. Any longer than that, I'm not really sure if it gets too brittle. So I would say you're safe with doing up to 3 days as long as it's stored in an airtight container. Now that my dough is nice and cold, I'm going to take it and put it on a floured surface, and I'm going to start rolling it out. I like to roll my dough out to be about 1/8 of an inch thick. Any more than that, I find that sometimes the bottom doesn't cook all the way. So I'm going to roll this out and then fit it into a buttered pie plate. I like to cut off any excess of the dough around the edges, and sometimes I will roll this dough out later and cut shapes of leaves out, or sometimes we'll do miniature snowflakes or any small size cookie cutters that we have, and we'll lay it over top of the pie just to give it an extra decorative look to it. And then sometimes we also will save up the dough if we have enough and roll it out and add some butter and sugar and cinnamon to it and slice it into strips and bake it on its own for a special little treat to have. This is something that my grandmother used to do with us kids when I was little, and my kids enjoy doing that today. You can finish your pie crust off with whatever edge you like best. I like to do a nice crimped edge. You could use a fork to press around the edges, or you could just leave it kind of rustic and have the edge folded over neatly. Now that our crust is all in our pie plate, I'll usually stick that back in the refrigerator while I get my apples prepared. I like to cut up different types of apples. I find that if you get a good mixture of more sweet or more tangy apples, the flavor works nicely together. I also usually like to add in one Macintosh apple or an apple that has a little more water content to it, because I do like to have that difference of texture in my pie where some of the apples are a little more firm and then some cook down more into a sauce. I think that that gives the pie a nice texture when you're eating it. This pie, I usually end up using anywhere from 6 to 7 apples in it, depending on the size of them. I've measured out how much these apples weighed, and it was just under 3 pounds worth of apples, to give you a better idea of how many apples I like to put in my pie. I usually pile them up pretty high when I'm first making it, knowing that they are going to cook down. You don't want your pie to be too thin, but then again, if it's too thick, sometimes it'll end up bubbling over the edges of the pie plate, and that can make for a little bit of a mess inside of your oven. After getting the core out of my apples, I like to just slice them into nice thin slices, and I just place them into a bowl until I get them all sliced up. Sometimes when I'm making this, if it's cool enough in the kitchen and I don't feel the need to put the pie crust back in the refrigerator, I will just leave it on the counter, and as I slice the apples up, I'll place them right into the pie crust without needing to use a bowl for that. Once I have all of my apples sliced up, I'm going to place them in the unbaked pie crust and mix up a half a cup of sugar and 1 teaspoon of cinnamon to sprinkle over all of the slices of apples. I just evenly sprinkle this over. I used to actually cover the apples in a bowl with this and toss it around, and I find that you don't really need to do that step. As the pie is baking, the flavors from the sugar and cinnamon soak down through all of the apples and it gets mixed all on its own. So any extra step that I don't need to do, I've found that I just remove that step from making the pie, and it makes it a much quicker process. Now I'm going to make the crumb topping for this. For that, I measure out 3/4 of a cup of flour, a half a cup of sugar, and 1 stick of butter. I dice the butter up just like I was doing for the pie crust, and then I crumble it up with my fingers and get all of the ingredients evenly mixed together, and then I sprinkle that over top of the apple slices. I bake this pie at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for about 40 to 45 minutes. When you pull the pie out, you want to just make sure that the top is a nice golden brown color. If you find that the edges of your pie crust are browning too quickly, you can use a metal pie ring to put over top of the edges of your crust, or you can use some strips of foil, and that will have the same effect of slowing down the browning process. For our next apple dessert, I decided to film while I was preparing some apple pie filling for some apple hand pies that we were going to be making with our homeschool co-op. This is a really easy way to get your apples softened up for those desserts that maybe don't need to be baked as long as an apple pie would need to bake. For this recipe, I ended up measuring out 3 pounds of apples. I peeled them, cored them, and sliced them and diced them up into small pieces. These pieces I diced up into anywhere from a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch long by about 1/4 of an inch thick. I wanted them to be nice and small, so when you were eating the hand pie, it didn't seem like you had too much of a chunk of apple. And I thought that the small size would also help them be nice and soft inside the pie when we were only going to be baking them for about 20 minutes. I added that to a Dutch oven and started heating them over medium heat. And then I added a 1/2 cup of water to that and a 1/4 cup of brown sugar and a teaspoon of ground cinnamon. And I turned up the heat a little bit just to get this boiling, and then I turned it back down so it was just at a simmer for about 20 minutes. And I kept going back and stirring that just so nothing would stick to the bottom. And I kept checking it just to because I didn't want that to get so cooked down that it was an applesauce, but I did want it to be nice, soft pieces of apple.
I've let these apples cook on the stovetop for about 15 to 20 minutes. They are starting to get nice and soft, but I don't want them to get too mushy. I've decided on apples that aren't like Macintosh that have so much water in them that they'll get mashed up, the kind of like an applesauce. But these ones are holding together really nicely. I've let them cool for a little while, and now I'm just going to put them in a glass bowl, and I will take them tomorrow when we go to our co-op. And this will be nice and easy. They can just scoop however much they need out of the bowl and onto their hand pie. So I'm going to get that put into the bowl, and we'll get it put into the refrigerator. See if I can do this without dumping it. This smells so good and cinnamony. I tasted it a little while ago just to make sure that it had a nice amount of sweetness to it, and it was really good. I think I ended up using a half a cup of brown sugar and a teaspoon of ground cinnamon for this. And I used 7 apples, which was about 3 pounds. This should be plenty filling for the hand pies that we make tomorrow. While our apple pie filling was cooking on the stovetop, I made 3 batches of pie dough. This we will be able to divide up and make probably about 8 hand pies per pie dough. So I'm going to get these put into the refrigerator so they can be nice and cold for tomorrow. I used my pie crust recipe where you can make it in a food processor. It's super easy and quick, and I was able to make these 3 pie crusts just in the amount of time that the apples were cooking on the stovetop.
The next apple dessert we're making is an apple harvest coffee cake. This recipe calls for 1 apple and about a half a cup of apple sauce. And after making the apple pie filling for our co-op group, I was thinking that if I didn't have applesauce on hand, I could just take about a half a cup of that apple pie filling and use my hand blender and blend that up, and that would work just as well for the applesauce in this coffee cake as if I were using applesauce. So that's something for me to keep in mind for another time, that if I don't have applesauce on hand, I can always just cook up some of these apples and make my own applesauce. So the original recipe on my website calls for a 1/4 cup of finely chopped pecans in the streusel topping. And on this particular day, I didn't add the pecans to it because not everyone in my family likes to have the chopped pecans in there, so I left it out. If I were making this for myself, I think I would include them because I do think they give a really nice extra flavor to the coffee cake. So for this streusel topping, I just used the 1/3 cup of all-purpose flour a 1/4 cup of brown sugar, a 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, and about an 1/8 teaspoon of salt. And I get that all mixed together, and to that I add 2 tablespoons of unsalted butter, which I've melted, and I mix those all up and just place that over to the side until I need to add it to the cake. For the cake, I used 1 1/2 cups of all-purpose flour, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 3/4 cup of brown sugar, a 1/2 cup of coconut oil melted, 2 large eggs, 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract, a 1/2 cup of applesauce, and 1 cup diced apple. And I like to dice those up into about a 1/2 inch cubes, and usually 1 apple can get you enough apple for the recipe. I am going to link down below the recipe for this coffee cake. It's on my website, handmadehome.us. I will always try to put any of the recipes that I'm making. If I have the recipe for it, I will link it below in the description. And if I haven't yet added the recipe to my website, keep checking back because I am trying to add new recipes to the website each week. I take all of my dry ingredients and mix them together in a bowl, and then I whisk together my melted coconut oil and brown sugar. Then I add in my eggs one at a time, whisking in between. Add in my vanilla extract, applesauce, and diced apples. And then I pour my dry ingredients in with the sugar mixture and get it all mixed together. You just want to make sure that you're not mixing it up too much at this point because you want to have a nice and fluffy cake. Then I pour it all into a prepared 9-inch round cake pan. And I bake it at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 35 to 40 minutes. I like to insert a toothpick into the center of the cake, and as long as it comes out clean, I know that the cake is baked all the way through. Then I'll let the cake cool on a wire rack for about 15 minutes, and then I gently turn the cake out of the pan. Once the cake is completely cool, I mix up a glaze of a 1/2 cup confectioner sugar, 1 tablespoon of milk, and then I drizzle that over the top.
Thank you for joining me in the kitchen, and I hope that this was a little bit of fall inspiration for you in your kitchen. And I would love to hear what you are making for your family with some of these delicious apples. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.